Our mental model of anti-Semitism is changing, and that has consequences for how we think about fighting anti-Semitism that we need to understand.
Anti-Semitism is not just a normal bigotry.
Anti-Semitism is known as a shape-shifting virus. I fear that this hatred, which has been endemic, which has been insidious, which has been as old as man itself, is now being supercharged by social media.
Think about it like an intellectual disease that's built into the foundations of the civilization that we live in.
You might think that this is rather arrogant of me, but I do believe it is a special form of racism. It's different to other forms of racism.
This is the traditional idea of anti-Semitism that anyone who grew up in the West will find familiar. An ancient primordial superstition whose seed survives in the soul of each of us and reappears regularly through history, each time in different form. For that reason, we'll call it the dormant disease model. The term shape-shifting was popularized by Emory professor Deborah Lipstadt, from whom we'll hear again in our video on Islamophobia. And it's important because it solves the problem of finding a single unifying definition of anti-Semitism that works for all its manifestations over history. If it is a dormant disease, where might it come from? How did it first come to be? Is it explained by evolution? Was it somehow adaptive to our ancestors? The biggest problem with the model of a dormant, primordial but shape-shifting virus, which reemerges every now and then but in different form, is that it's so general that it could be anything.
Socrates would ask questions.
The theory is unfalsifiable, and worse, not very actionable. How do we recognize it? Predict it? More importantly, how do we cure it? These issues have made space for a new, and in many ways better, theory of anti-Semitism. Let's call it the reimported virus model of anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism may be ingrained in the cultural fabric of certain segments of our society.
We've got people in our country who are calling Australia home when they don't have Australia in their heart.
And the theory goes something like this. We Europeans used to be infected with a virus of anti-Semitism.
It's an ancient hatred, perhaps the most ancient among the monotheisms.
But we've faced our demons and inoculated ourselves. However, migrants from less advanced societies are reimporting that virus back into ours.
And we've imported it.
In the same way that they might be reimporting tuberculosis or smallpox. Given the demographics of the protests we see on our streets today, you can understand how this theory has intuitive appeal. And if you're someone who already has a reason to be suspicious of non-European immigration,
poorly integrated migrants,
you can understand how it makes total sense.
Waves and waves and waves of immigrants. Let's be really honest about this. Some of them do not share our values.
Well, many of them, very large numbers.
Unlike the first theory, it suggests by its very definition an approach to combating the disease. First, just as with the plague or HIV in our recent history, stop importing it.
Big questions are being asked about multiculturalism because suddenly we find the importation of ancient hatreds.
What a grave mistake to let in so many people.
John, I agree with you. I mean, you will know that I was never in politics. I was never comfortable with the concept, the doctrine of multiculturalism.
Then, slow down the spread.
We're not getting pushed around anymore.
By identifying the infected and preventing them from infecting others in our society.
We're now seeing consequences levied against those who take action and stand against our people.
Either by isolating them or encouraging them to keep their diseases hidden away.
There needs to be a price to be paid for being an anti-Semite.
Socrates would ask questions.
If you're the partner of a law firm and you see an applicant has engaged in this sort of conduct, don't employ them.
Which raises the question, why don't we think of anti-Semitism as just another form of racism?
You might think that this is rather arrogant of me, but I do believe it is a special form of racism. It's different to other forms of racism.
But is it really? What's the evidence? This brings us to another model of anti-Semitism that merits consideration. Our third model, popular today only among people you might describe as heretics, but which has many merits worth highlighting. Let's call it the unhealthy organism model, in which anti-Semitism is just one of many potential viruses or diseases lurking in the bowels of society, and when the system is weak enough, one of them erupts, just like HIV, by hijacking the sociological equivalent of CD4 positive T cells, which is our tribal instinct. The thing that we evolved to protect us from societal threats. It hijacks that instinct and directs it into hatred for specific groups. Each instance may be different, so one could call it shape-shifting, but only in the sense that its specific targets, mechanisms, and manifestations are context-dependent. It is not shape-shifting in its essence, which is that it takes advantage of the tendency of tribal apes to be suspicious, sometimes fearful, and even sometimes hateful of apes from other tribes. It's in our nature, as demonstrated by people who study racism and discrimination as a general human phenomenon, as Isabel Wilkins did in her highly readable book about caste. She makes the case that all forms of racism or discrimination are manifestations of behaviors which have a common set of core characteristics, the most important being this: the actual divisions themselves are totally arbitrary. Religion, ethnicity, occupational category, language, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's why they seem shape-shifting to us. That's also why recognizing that fact is a fantastic way to build solidarity around the challenge of fighting it, because it really is a shared objective.
The treatment of anti-Semitism as distinct from all other forms of racism really undermines the important work that is already being done across racial lines to address all forms of racism.
Our monkey brains are hardwired to recognize tribe, but tribe could be anything. If you've ever participated in one of those exercises in experimental psychology, where a class or group is divided arbitrarily, and after a few hours of carefully structured games, are replicating minor versions of all the superstitions and animosities that can actually divide society, if you've ever done that for half a day, you know how easy it can be, and how eerie it is to realize that. It can even be on something as simple as eye color, as Jane Elliott famously and controversially demonstrated using her own class of third graders as guinea pigs. But just because it can be anything doesn't mean it shall be anything. Certain things are more attractive as targets for our tribal instinct. Low status and power is probably number one, which is why institutionalized racism and discrimination against slaves, or former slaves, or conquered people, or simply people who live in less developed societies, those are obvious candidates. That's why, if you're watching this in Australia, unless you're Greek, my ancestors probably referred to yours as Varavari, the origin of the English word barbarian. Behavioral and personality differences, like homosexuality, gender dysmorphia, autism, or other traits that might make someone seem different or eccentric, are likewise easy to understand targets of this tribal instinct, and no doubt explains the fate of many people condemned as witches and heretics over the ages. And if one is part of a community that is inherited by sheer accident of history and the intellectual laziness of our forefathers, an asterisk next to their identity, that too is something which will amplify the odds that, at any given moment of societal breakdown, it will be that community, rather than some other, who is chosen as the victim. That might explain why Ashkenazi Jews in Europe experienced anti-Semitism as
not just a normal bigotry,
because to them it was different. They weren't impoverished Roma moving from town to town. They weren't sharecroppers or naked indigenous people.
Think about it like an intellectual disease that's built into the foundations of the civilization that we live in.
They weren't the wretched of the earth. They were like anybody, from peasants in the shtetl to physicians and bankers to kings. And yet the focus of this tribal instinct and all the cruelty it renders seems so reliably to land on them.
This hatred, which has been endemic, which has been insidious, which has been as old as man itself.
It's no wonder that they came to believe there must be something unique about it.
I do believe it is a special form of racism. It is different to other forms of racism.
This isn't to minimize anyone's trauma.
It's this irrational hatred.
It's not about comparative victimization. It's about diagnosis, making sure we are actually diagnosing the problem. Consider the example of AIDS. HIV hit different in different communities. In Africa, AIDS was a disease of heterosexual men and made them victims to well-known maladies: tuberculosis, meningitis, and gastrointestinal bacteria that did not threaten gay men in San Francisco. Their maladies were entirely different. One could imagine, therefore, that from the perspective of an ACT UP activist in the 80s, AIDS for gay American men
is different.
That would have been totally understandable. We would not judge someone for thinking that, but it would still be wrong.
Socrates would ask questions.
What's worse, if we simply accepted that argument because it was their lived experience, if you like, we might still be on a wild goose chase trying to figure HIV out. The point is simply this: all of us, regardless of our background, are born with the innate tendency to continue a struggle that started a long time ago and looks something like this. Turns out, we have a gun analyst on the team who wrote a large language model to translate the barks and vocalizations of the lead ape in the top tribe into English. And here's what he's saying.
Our country is the best place on earth to live, and we want to keep it that way.
2 million years of evolution, ladies and gentlemen. From rainforest to Rhodes Scholarship.
Israel is the most wonderful country in the world, the most remarkable. I can prove it on every level.
And all the way to Harvard University. Now, before you get too depressed about human nature, remember that drive isn't destiny. We may have an innate drive to tribal conflict, just as we have an innate drive to consume sugar, and both for the same reasons. Once upon a time, it was adaptive. It's no longer adaptive, and that doesn't mean we're destined to type 2 diabetes. We can master our tendencies, including tendencies towards conflict and division, but only by recognizing their drivers and addressing them proactively. In other words, by building healthy societies, or healthy bodies, healthy organisms, to return to our medical analogy. What does that mean? Rather than only talking about rules and restrictions on speech in the hope that perhaps that might have an effect on thought.
The cities should not be utilised for that. There should be places designated away from where the Jewish community might venture, where people can demonstrate.
Let's build channels of communication to make racist ideas less compelling.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Rather than only talking about safety and security.
And that is not to in any way attack the right of people to express their views. But at some point, every single week becomes intimidatory.
Maybe building mechanisms to ensure people's capacity to express grievances and be heard.
If we have influence in certain segments of society, whether it be business, the arts, the legal community, academia, it is because that influence has been earned through our blood and through our toil. And it is time, I believe, to exert that influence.
Which makes political violence much less likely.
Across all sectors where Jews have influence, we need to bring that influence to bear.
As we said in our last video, that's fair enough. But any solution to social cohesion must also explicitly account for the fact that every Australian wants to have their voice be heard and their influence brought to bear. There is no such thing as social cohesion otherwise. There is only, at best, peace and tranquility, which is nice if that's all one is after, but it's the tranquility of the narcotic, the opiate of the powerful. The simple fact is that not every Australian can pick up the phone and call the Premier, or text the chair of the ABC, or broadcast an email to its board and its exco. We'll stipulate that if Mr. Mashney could do all those things, he too, along with every other protester on a college campus and in the streets, would find better ways to spend their weekends. But every Australian can say,
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore!
if the anger and the frustration is great enough, and take action accordingly. There's a reason the movie that made that line famous came out in 1976, along with the violence associated with that time period, even in the richest countries in the world. Because that period was not the harmonious, culturally homogeneous paradise that young right-wingers fantasize about today. We really don't want to go back to those days, nor should we just presume that that was as bad as things could ever get. Social cohesion is an incredibly valuable public good. It's not a gift from God. Prior generations worked hard to create it, and we have to do the same to preserve it. Which brings us to the most important implication. Rather than listening only to holy men who believe themselves to represent a diverse range of voices in Australia,
we've got people in our country who hate our country.
But as we shall see in the next two videos,
Anti-Israel is really anti-Jewish because they want Israel to disappear.
They know that they cannot say Jew, so they say Zionist.
Are dangerously out of touch with the reality for large and growing segments of Australian society.
Real Islamophobia would be a terrible and unwarranted thing.
If and when evidence of Islamophobia presents itself, yes, we should condemn it.
Demand better standards of rigor, empathy, and evidence from people who have not demonstrated a handle on the underlying divisions in our society.
These are politically determined. They're not simply because that's the way Arabs are. Right. That's the way Muslims are. And it's that racist discourse that I think is part of what makes it so hard for us to imagine that equality actually could make us safe.
So, why might we be losing the war against anti-Semitism given the three models we've described? It might be nothing more remarkable than having the wrong mental model of anti-Semitism, the wrong mental model of the disease. To see why, consider the following parable, the parable of the empire and the plague. Once there was a magnificent empire that ruled over land and sea. Its cities were centers of commerce, art, science, and learning. Its armies policed the frontiers, and its navies kept the waterways safe and free. Its leaders were most virtuous, its alchemists, magi, and philosophers most brilliant, its art the most breathtaking, its engineering the most awe-inspiring, and most important of all, its holy men were as kindly and wise and holy as any holy men could possibly ever be. As you can imagine, the subjects of this empire were the most happy and prosperous of any people before them or any who would ever follow. And then one day there descended upon the empire a plague. It ravaged cities, it terrorized communities, and the people turned to the holy men to tell them what to do. Everyone looked to the holy men with desperation and supplication. Lords and their peasants, patricians and plebeians, even the emperor himself. They wanted to know, why has this plague come upon us, and how shall we make it go away?
You say AIDS is God's judgment on homosexual promiscuity.
Which was just common sense.
We pay the price when we violate the laws of God.
Who could argue with the importance of obeying the laws of God? Who could dispute facts that everyone could see? The plague was plainly most prevalent in the brothels and taverns and the bathhouses where those promiscuous people were known to congregate. The people resolved to obey God's laws. They prayed more. They tithed more. They warned the promiscuous and the morally degenerate to repent and change their ways. They did everything the holy men told them to do, but the plague would not go away. You must do it more, said the holy men. The devil isn't easily overcome. And they did do more. And the plague would still not go away. And then one day the holy men discovered a problem that was staring them all in the face. There were heretics who were leading people astray.
Abandoning Israel, we desert God.
These wicked tricksters were teaching the people to ignore the laws of God, to ignore what the holy men said about degeneracy and promiscuity, claiming that God didn't care who they loved or how, and that the very idea was the work of man's imagination, not the will of God.
It's inverted. So the lives of the children of Gaza and the other people of Gaza are considered not to be precious.
They even claimed that this whole obsession with certain kinds of sex, instead of the meaning of the scriptures, was nothing short of idolatry.
but the right of the existence of Israel as a Jewish state with a certain political system is considered sacrosanct. And to me, that's idolatry.
They told the people that the plague had nothing to do with God, that it had nothing to do with anything. Just a packet of proteins and genetic material arranged so perfectly as to insert itself into certain immune cells, CD4 positive T cells, hijacking them into the service of replication rather than their purpose of fighting disease. To end it, the heretics claim, we simply needed to practice what they called safe sex to inhibit the plague's transmission, while our magi and philosophers worked out how to thwart its work inside our bodies, and one day even teaching our immune cells to recognize and kill it so that it would go away. To the holy men, this was heresy on top of blasphemy.
Rabbis know that if you publicly criticize Israel too harshly, you very may well lose your job. Or if you're a teacher at a Jewish school or a Jewish camp, people know this very well.
Worse, it was a danger to the very safety of the realm.
Biggest single enemy to the Jewish people are not the Islamic supremacists. The biggest enemy you have is inside the wire.
Instead of fearing the fury of God and changing their promiscuous and degenerate ways, these heretics were encouraging more of it, telling young people that they could do whatever they wanted.
We wanted you to be Zionists. We did not intend that our emphasis on tikkun olam, social repair, would lead some Jews to join anti-Israel demonstrations.
Love whom they wanted to love, as long as it was safe. They were actually promoting the very wickedness that brought God's judgment upon us. What's worse, they were doing it deliberately.
If Jews raise a fist, they raise a fist in order to smash their own chests.
No matter how they dress it up, it's anti-Semitism.
They were doing it because they hate the empire.
We've got people in our country who hate our country.
And this issue is not just about Jews, it's about America.
They hate its values.
Who are calling Australia home when they don't have Australia in their heart.
And they're not just opposed to Jews, although they are.
They hate its heroes and virtues.
They hate us, they hate our values, they hate what we stand for.
They're opposed to the West, they're opposed to capitalism, they're opposed to America.
They aren't like us and will never be.
A lot of people don't want to integrate.
And so whatever one may think of them as individuals, personally, no matter how sympathetic or even reasonable some may appear to be,
anti-Israel Jews are not part of a big tent.
As emperor, it is your duty to never lose sight of the danger they pose to all of us collectively.
You have an enemy inside the wire.
And you have to fight them. You have to fight them the same way as you fight other anti-Semites, because they are simply Jewish anti-Semites.
They told the emperor he must convene the imperial cabinet, and he did so right away.
National cabinet will convene on that, and there's a couple of other issues.
Consuls, praefecti, and legati all summoned to the capital and assembled at the court. The empress, beloved and trusted consort and counselor to the emperor, co-ruler and Augusta in her own right, rose to speak. The lesson of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us where promiscuity, wickedness, and contempt for God's laws
leads if it's not confronted.
And so they resolved to confront it, to root out the heretics and stamp out the heresy. Blasphemous scrolls were identified and banned from the public square.
What's going on over at the ABC with anti-Semitism? They keep putting out all this Jew-hating garbage, then deleting it when they inevitably get rinsed. Today they've deleted an anti-Israel TikTok video featuring a Palestinian reporter.
Denying access to food is collective punishment.
Israel will argue, obviously, that it has a right to defend itself.
People were terrified of using the word genocide in coverage. They still are.
The most well-known heretics were denounced and disgraced.
Just last week, a court case began over the ABC's sacking of high-profile presenter Antoinette Lattouf, while in another case, cricket commentator Peter Lawler was told to pack his bags.
There's also a climate of fear that exists in the American Jewish community.
The campaign against Gary Lineker has been vicious and lengthy and led by the UK Lawyers for Israel.
The judge suppressed for 10 years the names and addresses of a group called Lawyers for Israel.
This was a manufactured backlash.
Who were allegedly behind the campaign of complaints against Latouche.
Others, toiling amongst the scribes and officials, were discovered privately agreeing with the heretics.
Accused of anti-Semitism after he was exposed for tweeting terrorist propaganda and anti-Israel conspiracies.
They were rooted out and revealed.
Survey by the Anti-Defamation League finding that anti-Semitism is still on the rise in America.
But the plague still would not go away.
So to see that more than double in just 5 years is shocking.
It kept spreading.
Anti-Jewish sentiment around the world is at its highest level since the survey began a decade ago.
And kept getting worse.
The lids have been blown off the sewers by the anti-Zionists. So
I don't want to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, but
they're the same. They're two hues of the same color.
And then one day the Augusta whispered to her husband, the emperor, "We've listened to the holy men for years. We've done everything they told us to do. Why don't we summon some of those heretics and just hear what they have to say?" And so quietly, without fanfare, some of the heretics were brought out from the dungeon and granted an audience, not with the imperial couple, that would be too alarming in the middle of a plague, but with a magister officiorum, what today we would call a foreign minister, whose judgment, confidence, and discretion they trusted. Unfortunately, you know what it's like inside the imperial palace. The statues have ears, the mosaics have eyes. The holy men quickly learned of the encounter and condemned the magister's treachery.
Have a look. Exactly who Penny Wong has given credibility to by posing in photographs with him and meeting him in her office. It's the head of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, Nasser Mashni.
But it was too late. Her Excellency Magistra Penelope found the heretics persuasive and persuaded the imperial couple. They decreed that safe sex be taught in schools and ordered the magi and philosophers to study the plague, not as judgment from God, but as the packet of proteins and genetic material the heretics claimed it to be. And within a decade, the plague had ceased to be. The emperor and his Augusta realized that they had been wrong to listen to the holy men and would never again allow themselves to believe that their subjects
paid our country
simply because the holy men said so. The holy men, recognizing the error of their ways, threw themselves before the emperor's mercy. "Forgive us, Lord Emperor, it was the devil who led us astray." The Augusta, seeing their trembling, was moved to sympathy. Her heart softened as she recalled the many things they said over the years which were wise. She reminded the emperor that even as they got the plague wrong, they got many other things right. The empire needed them too. One day, it might be the heretics who were wrong about something. The emperor rose to speak, addressing the trembling holy men. "It was not the devil who led you astray," he declared, "but your own immovable and unchallenged assumptions. You persecuted my subjects. You hindered my physicians. You discouraged the people from protecting themselves, all because of ideas about the world you inherited from your predecessors, which you had no interest in challenging or validating yourselves. And most unforgivable of all, you showed no curiosity to understand, even as the empirical evidence mounted, that your understanding of the world was wrong, and your advice to my court misguided. But I see in your terror that a lesson has been learned. Rise and be pardoned, but take care to never let yourselves forget it." And with that, the emperor pardoned the holy men. They returned to their flocks. The people resumed their lives, and the empire reigned for another 1,000 years. In fact, it lives on to this very day in the memory of those who know what was once possible for humanity and maybe one day shall again be.
Strength and honor. Strength and honor. Strength and honor.
The lesson of the parable is not that the holy men were wrong. Anyone can be wrong. It's not a crime to be wrong. Their crime, if I may say so, was that they were incurious. Indeed, Sir John, that is the lesson of the parable of the empire and the plague.
You have to wrap your mind around the idea, which is a huge, huge, huge idea, that anti-Semitism is built into the scaffolding of Western civilization.
That's former New York Times columnist and social critic Barry Weiss.
It's this irrational hatred, but it is so, so deep because it goes back to the most important myth that Western civilization is built on, and that is the Christian story.
At least going back to 380 and the Edict of Thessaloniki, when the Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman state. One imagines that he found it awkward in those days, when asked by subjects, "Who killed the Messiah?" to have to always say, "We did, the Roman state." To be fair to Theodosius, the Gospels do describe considerable political and popular pressure on the prefect of Judea, a relatively minor Roman official from a family of well-to-do plebeians named Pontius Pilatus, or Pontius Pilate today, who technically had the authority of imperial appointment, but just as with any magistrate or governor in colonial Australia or Raj, India, in all likelihood was unknown to the emperor himself because Judea was a territory within the greater imperial province of Syria, ruled from Antioch by a proper patrician and senator named Lucius Aelius Lamia. So it's not impossible that Pilatus might have felt career pressure to accommodate the wishes of febrile crowds, because his boss, just like bosses throughout all time, was august and famous and excellent and had better things to worry about than noisy troubles in Judea. Many leaders and administrators all throughout history would probably understand how Pontius Pilate might have felt. The Gospels were written immediately after the Jewish revolt and destruction of the temple. They were written by a group of Jewish heretics who would have had tremendous incentive to minimize the subversive parts of Jesus' teachings and the role of the Roman state in his execution. It was during this period that the Nazarene heretic and zealot known to his followers as Yeshua bar Yosef min Matzat, Joshua, son of Joseph of Nazareth, and then after the alleged resurrection, as Meshika, or Messiah, the Anointed One, was transformed into Jesus Christos, Joshua the Messiah, Jesus Christ. 3 centuries later, you can imagine how appealing these Rome-friendly accounts of Jesus' life and death must have seemed to Theodosius and his contemporaries, who, over the next century, would re-architect the foundation of the Roman state and its legitimacy around the good news of the arrival of the Messiah. Those men created what we would today call political Christianity, or Christianism, a core tenet of which was that Rome's representative did everything he could to save the Messiah, but was dragged against his will into ordering his execution, evocatively washing his hands and transferring blame to crowds who shouted, in the poignant words of Matthew, "His blood be upon us and on our children." Thus came to be what today we call the Deicide libel, the idea that it was the Jews who killed the Messiah, the guilt for which they transferred, knowingly and consciously, to their descendants. Although it's just a story, it is a core part of the foundational myths of Christian civilization. It is, as Ms. Weiss says, the intellectual seed from which so much other ignorance, superstition, and hate will grow. The mother of all Western anti-Semitic theories, and, as we shall explain in this video, arguably the origin story for Western anti-Semitism. Because as we all know, stories matter, even when we know they aren't true.
Freedom for the white man! Freedom for the white man!
That libel put a permanent asterisk next to every Jew in the minds of Christians among whom they lived. As we know, over the centuries that asterisk could be incredibly consequential, and catastrophically so, in moments of crisis and societal collapse, such as during a plague or invasion or war, or sometimes merely because a king sniffed out an opportunity to make a little money and cancel some debts. For these reasons, Barry Weiss is justified in saying, obviously metaphorically, that
anti-Semitism is built into the scaffolding of Western civilization.
So it's worth really understanding how some of the over-the-top rhetoric came to be, and how that in turn became manifest in a history of anti-Semitism. How did this libel last so long? Yes, it has its origins in the Gospels, but any Roman of Theodosius' rank in the 4th century would have known very well what historians have recently rediscovered and brought back to our attention. That crucifixion, which wasn't abolished until the time of Constantine, was not a sentence that was commonly imposed, and Roman law did not impose it on thieves, bandits, highway robbers, or even murderers, certainly not religious heretics. It was the ultimate Roman punishment. It was reserved for rebellious subjects and mutinous slaves. It's hard to imagine that even the most browbeaten and beleaguered Pilate, henpecked by Caiaphas in the Temple Synedrion, would have resorted to such a sentence when there were so many other ways to satisfy his stakeholders among the Judean religious establishment. So why didn't anyone point this out in the 4th century? You could blame anti-Semitism. There's no question Constantine, Theodosius, Justinian, and especially the patriarch John Chrysostomos would be considered anti-Semites by modern standards. But judged by the norms of their own time, there's little evidence that they actively hated Jews in any virulent or personal way. These were men who said harsh things about many groups across the empire: pagans, heretics, secular philosophers, and rival Christians. It was a time when the rules of both church and state were being formed, and Christians killed thousands of fellow Christians over questions like whether Christ was begotten and made or begotten not made. If you're a Christian, but not Unitarian, Jehovah's Witness, or Latter-day Saint, you probably recognize that phrase, begotten not made, because you recite it every Sunday, as Nicene Christians have done for almost 17 centuries. So you may have no idea just how much blood was once spilled over the difference between and made and not made. But that's the nature of sectarian disputes about God, identity, meaning, belonging. They can be awful, and people can be cruel. That's why it's the subject of an entire episode in this series. The point here is, there's no real evidence that the architects of political Christianity, the emperors, bishops, theologians, and senators, were driven by hatred of Jews. In the Game of Thrones world of 4th and 5th century Rome, they had far bigger things to worry about. They also would have access to scholars who would have known that a Judean tax collector like Matthew is unlikely to have been sufficiently proficient in Greek to have written his eponymous gospel. That means that whoever wrote the words, "His blood be upon us and our children," would have been an educated, Hellenized Jewish follower of Jesus writing in the wake of the destruction of the temple. He was a Jew and would have considered himself to be a Jew.
Sometimes I lay under the moon, I thank God I'm breathing.
He would not have called himself Christian, nor considered himself to have converted to anything. In the 1st century, he would have considered himself a Jew who recognized what the Torah promised, that the Messiah had finally come. So why would a Jewish man, who identified as a Jewish man, write something so awful about his own people? It's not hard to imagine when you really think about it. People say awful things about members of their own community when arguing over existential questions all the time. We've already mentioned inter-Christian rivalry and violence over the definition of the Trinity. As we all know, there would be much more inter-Christian cruelty and violence to come. In the decades after the crucifixion, Roman Jewry underwent a vicious schism over the question of the Messiah. That's when a young Jewish man with a Greek name, Stephanos, moved to Jerusalem from the diaspora and heard the good news himself. He quickly became a zealous volunteer for the movement. According to the New Testament, he was energetic and charismatic, although a bit of a hothead, as we'll soon see, which moved some conservative members of a local synagogue to denounce him. But in the words of Acts, they could not withstand the wisdom and spirit with which he spoke.
Because you don't have good argument,
is what you might imagine him saying to them. So again, according to the Bible, they decided to attack him rather than his arguments.
So the move is always to basically
teach them how to defend by attacking.
Turn it into a question about the motivations of the person who is making the criticism.
You have to know that that's the goal. You have to expose these people. You cannot allow them into a big tent.
According to Acts chapter 6, they secretly instigated people to accuse him of blasphemy, which in those days was a charge that you might say is even worse than the charge of anti-Semitism today, and set up false witnesses to get him hauled before the great Synedrion of the temple. 71 top rabbis and other Jerusalem big shots, presided over by the same Caiaphas of the Easter story. Unlike Jesus, whose alleged language before the Synedrion was relatively restrained, Stephen let him have it. His trial and oration, recounted in Acts chapter 7, could almost, with just a bit of wordsmithing, sound not out of place as the dialogue in some movie scene involving a radical college student coming home for the holidays, getting into a shouting match with his MAGA hat-wearing extended relatives. If Stephen lived in Australia today, You could imagine him canvassing for the Greens. The polemic ends in the kind of rhetorical doozy which would make any modern radical proud. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are uncircumcised. You're just like your predecessors, always resisting the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your predecessors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You who have received the law, but have not obeyed it. Stefan, we know you're passionate. Don't get me wrong, we love your passion. That's why we made you a deacon. Put you in charge of food aid to widows. Nothing wrong with passion. But are you sure you really wanted to speak so bluntly to the most powerful men in your own community? Was that appropriate? Was that wise?
I said what I said. I'd rather be famous instead.
As you can imagine, his audience didn't appreciate that display of insolent disrespect.
This is absolutely disgraceful.
We're the elders of our tribe. Yeah. I think we deserve to be acknowledged and respected.
Especially from an outsider who had only recently migrated to Judea and was stirring all the
poorly integrated migrants, cultural Marxists, the kind of renter crowd who don't like wealth. Certainly they don't like us being wealthy.
Enraged, they dragged him out of the temple where the mob is said to have stoned him to death, which is how Stephanus the deacon became Aius Stephanos, Saint Stephen, the first martyr. Did all that actually happen? Impossible to know. Like the Gospels, Acts was probably written decades after the alleged events by high-status Hellenized Jews who wrote in fine Greek, but would have been just children living in the diaspora when the events they chronicled in Jerusalem would have occurred. But it certainly could have happened. We can all recognize the kind of passion and anger people have always had when arguing over essential things. Some things never change. If the oration in Acts is actually what the first martyr said about conservative Jews in the year 35, imagine what others might have been capable of saying 50 years later, after God sent them what must have seemed like a pretty clear divine message by destroying the temple.
We let ourselves down, we let the country down, and this all results in ongoing long-term damage.
And yet, from their perspective, their fellow Jews would still not listen.
You're still a Jew. You're just a shit Jew.
That's Jewish Australian influencer Marnie Pearlstein, whom we met in the last video, talking about Jews who called for Australia to reject calls for ethnic cleansing. If she says that about fellow Jews who disagree with her about the Gaza war, imagine what she would say about people whom she believed denied the Messiah.
We desert God.
New York's Rabbi Hirsch said that about people who had
joined anti-Israel demonstrations,
believing it fundamentally un-Jewish for
American Jews to lead Passover Seders in so-called liberated zones.
What would he say about Jews whom he believed denied the Messiah? And lest anyone accuse Neosis of being harsh or unfair with the early Christians, or more precisely, Jewish members of the emerging Jesus movement, known in those days as the Way, we must remember that the Jewish establishment they confronted could give as well as they could get. We already saw what they did to St. Stephen, but we have to be fair to the establishment too. Let's look at it from their perspective. Yes, Stephen's stoning was a bona fide lynching. Only Rome had the authority to execute someone in Judea. There's no question about that. But St. Stephen's effrontery was just the latest in a long series of offenses that, from their perspective, looked like an eternal war on Jewish identity, unity, and national character.
There has been a war on our culture for the best part of 50 years.
50 years? Try 200 years, Mr. Abbott, at least since they built the Greek gymnasium overlooking Solomon's temple, where the children of Abraham went straight from prayers to congregate with the children of Yavon, discussing philosophy like little Socrateses, and then bathed and exercised with them, naked. Yes, in the buff.
This comes down to identity, and some will look at the hatred and will want to turn away from the Jewish identity, hide it, side with their oppressors, and others will become fortified in their sense of self and more determined to advocate.
Which is all they ever did. Nothing more than that. It wasn't persecution for the sake of persecution. You can't just conflate it with everyday intolerance. And now these Greek-speaking Jesus followers have decided that the wisdom and grace of the prophets, handed down through the Torah generation to generation, from Moses all the way down to their own fathers, they're claiming that all of that now belongs to everyone. Everyone, whether or not they're Jewish. From Caesar in Rome to the most lowly uncircumcised slave in Caesarea. Whatever their background, culture, religion, or race.
It assumes that all cultures are equal. All cultures are not equal.
Correct.
They pretend that all religions are basically the same.
The idea that every culture is equal is nonsense.
Not even Jesus himself ever went that far. So these parable peddlers were truly making stuff up as they went along. They claim this is all about expanding God's kingdom.
The coming of the light.
Oh, how they love to throw Isaiah back at everyone's face. Light unto nations.
Sometimes just because they don't know what they're talking about.
Probably the only line in the Torah that any of them even know. But the truth is...
The best immigrants are your own children.
That wasn't even the worst of it. Around 10 years after Stephen's stoning, the traitor Saul, known today as Paul, a man in whom the Sanhedrin had invested so much attention and hope, boy was he a disaster, he has this thought bubble. Maybe Gentiles joining the Jesus movement didn't even need to become Jews.
Oh no, there's nothing superior about our culture. Yes, there is.
Of course there is.
Circumcision? Optional. No worries if you're not up to it. Kashrut? Again, if you can't live without pork, what the heck? Who is God to deny you your cheesy bacon sandwich? As we can all understand, to the elders of the Temple Sanhedrin, this was all nothing more than a road to perdition. Nothing short of a plan for national suicide, because any intelligent person knows that it is no more possible to pick and choose from among the laws of God than it is to choose one's own sex or gender. It is God who makes these choices, not man. Yet somehow people were buying this nonsense.
And yet, maybe people are just incredibly ignorant. I think they probably are.
Most people are stupid.
It seems they are indeed, because every day there were more and more of these people. Confused heretics confusing others in turn. More and more families had their own stories to tell about losing a son or daughter to this cult, or almost losing them. This wasn't just a different point of view. It was a movement that could no longer be ignored.
So we have large numbers of barbarians inside our gates. That's the reality.
And those barbarians had to be confronted, because they were an existential threat to everything they and their ancestors accomplished, going back to Mattathias the Hasmonean and his son, Judah Maccabee.
Star of David around my neck, hey. Man, I feel like Judah Maccabee. Man, I feel like Judah Maccabee.
We're losing all of that. We're losing our commitment to it.
And the consequences could simply no longer be ignored.
We're more divided. We're poorer. We're more challenged. We're less just as societies. Mm-hmm. And our young people are really not doing very well.
So you can understand how the Temple Sanhedrin, along with probably the majority of thinking Jewish people, must have felt at that time.
We need to resist the attack on our culture. It's our patrimony. It's our heritage. It's us. We have to defend it and assert it.
By identifying, exposing, and if necessary, bringing to justice too all those people who were luring the young, the impressionable, the naive, and the vulnerable into believing that they could ignore the laws of God simply by declaring,
I'm plainly Christian in terms of my personal convictions.
By the 60s, Nero's madness had plunged the entire empire into turmoil, adding Roman persecution on top of all that as well. So when we think about all this context, perhaps we can understand why the language of the Gospels sounds the way it does, and how the pretext for what would eventually become the Deicide libel, the mother of all anti-Semitic libels, Western anti-Semitism's origin story, came to be.
Sure, some things we've got wrong, no doubt about that.
To be clear, we at Neosis think that writing, His blood be upon us and our children, is an ignorant, vindictive, and hateful thing to say about any human being, no matter how much anger and contempt you might have for them and their ideas.
Judaism without Israel, it's not a thing.
I don't think there should be a Jewish people if we don't have the state of Israel.
But at least whoever wrote Matthew didn't go that far.
Those are intolerable.
They might not have been Harvard professors or humanities medalists, But at least they had that much common sense. And don't get us started about Amalek, which is a Torah reference and metaphor that would have been as absolutely available to the authors of the Gospels as it is to Israeli prime ministers today. Can you imagine what the history of the Deicide libel, as awful as it already has been, and the history of anti-Semitism in the West might have been these past 1700 years, had they had the indecency to invoke that one? The point is that what we consider the anti-Semitic language of the Gospels can only be understood in the context of an existential argument between Jews of the day. An argument that, for very understandable reasons, would have been even more heated and even more febrile than arguments about Israel, Palestine, the war in Gaza, and even Zionism might be today. The thing is, and this is why we think the story is so revealing, none of that was relevant in the 4th century. Christian converts by then were mostly not Jews, and none of the passions which might excuse the over-the-top language in Matthew were relevant to them. In fact, they weren't even relevant to Jews anymore, because by then the schism was fully complete.
I have friends who are anti-Zionists. I'll come clean. I don't think I do.
And ancient history, as irrelevant to them as arguments about the royal legitimacy of the House of Stuart might be to us today. And yes, if you're wondering, there really are people who claim that this man, Duke of Bavaria, is the rightful King of England. But nobody's being polemical about it, because there's no need to be. By the same token, in 4th century Rome, there was never any need to let the emotive rhetoric of the Gospels evolve into a story about the Jews that Romans of that day would have known was almost surely untrue. So why did they let it happen? Why did they let what we now call the Deicide libel become so embedded in Christian historiography that almost 17 centuries later, Barry Weiss can credibly say,
you have to wrap your mind around the idea, which is a huge, huge, huge idea, that anti-Semitism is built into the scaffolding of Western civilization?
We can't know. But our hypothesis is that it's not some grand anti-Semitic conspiracy.
Hatred, which has been endemic, which has been insidious.
It's not an ancient hatred or shape-shifting virus.
Which has been as old as man itself.
It's probably for no better reason than that the story was convenient. That's it. It was convenient for the Roman architects of political Christianity, as banal and mundane as that may sound to us, knowing what we know about all that would follow. It's almost anticlimactic. All that horror, hatred, superstition, and persecution, could it really come down to something as banal as this? Powerful people, uncurious about a story because they found it convenient to be. History shows that powerful people have a reliable tendency to be uncurious about narratives which they find convenient.
Sure, some things we've got wrong, no doubt about that.
If convenience can make someone uncurious about big things, like the Passion of Christ, imagine how easy it is to be uncurious about little things, like what really happened at a protest over the Technion in Sydney last year, which we described in our last video, and where it is almost certain that no one actually tried to
stop people from harassing other people or intimidating other people from recognizing their religion and worshipping at religious buildings.
Powerful people are uncurious about conventional narratives all the time, even when there is plenty of evidence that should make them suspect they might be untrue. That's especially true when the victims of those narratives are powerless, insignificant, and voiceless, as 4th century Jews would have been to Constantine the Great. And as this Jewish man appears to be to the Premier of Victoria.
Victorian Premier Jacinta Allen had condemned the planned protest, saying people have a right to practice their religion in peace.
Or as these Jews appear to be to New South Wales Premier, to say nothing of the way this Jewish Australian woman appears to be to a whole host of people who profess to care about Jewish safety. And when the victims of narratives are powerless and insignificant people on the other side of the world,
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
Well, there's no limit to how uncurious powerful people have the capacity to be.
I do think that it took longer than it should have for people to come out and to decry this sexual violence, which was obviously so grievous.
To everything cutting babies' heads off to burning women and children alive.
So can we really blame Theodosius? It's not as if his kids had access to social media or a free press or were born into a society with pretensions of free speech and free inquiry. Of all the important lessons of the awful history of the Deicide libel and its resilience in our society to this very day, perhaps the most important is this. There is no limit to the awfulness that is possible when powerful people decide they have no obligation to be curious about narratives simply because they find it convenient not to be.
How would we assess the unhealthy organism model of anti-Semitism?
Socrates would ask questions.
Well, by asking the following questions, which we'd ask about any scientific model. First, is it consistent with the evidence and other things we know about ourselves, such as human biology? Yes, because that's where it comes from. Does it require belief in some unsubstantiatable and unexplainable assumption, like Aristotle's theory of ether to explain how light could travel through a vacuum? No. Unlike Professor Lipstadt's notion of a primordial virus, which is also shape-shifting, this requires nothing more than what we know about human evolution and society. Is it actionable, by which we mean it lends itself to ideas about what to do? Yes, again, as we've just demonstrated. Most important, how does it compare to the alternatives? As we see it, the unhealthy organism model of anti-Semitism is sufficiently more consistent with everything we know about the world and its alternatives, or at least so much more consistent that it should merit much more attention than we are seeing it getting. Maybe, just maybe, that might at least part explain why we are losing the war on anti-Semitism.
So to see that more than double in just 5 years is shocking.
Because the treatment isn't working. At some point, we have to consider the possibility that for this particular disease, the holy men are leading us astray. And not only that, we're going to have to consider the added possibility that we won't change the plague's trajectory until we start listening to different voices.
All forms of racism are interconnected. And what this means in terms of government responses is that instead of law and order approaches, we support those that oppose all forms of racism, which don't create hierarchies of racism and which target systemic and structural discrimination.
People asking questions that get to the heart of the question of the health of our society. Are we talking to each other? Do we have empathy for each other? Are we addressing questions of justice, equality, and shared humanity? The very things which inoculate us from hate. That's why it's so encouraging to see young people who really do have skin in the game increasingly take it upon themselves to show the world that there really is another way to tackle anti-Semitism, racism, and all other forms of discrimination, superstition, and hate.
The Jewish Council is deeply concerned about rises in anti-Semitism in Australia, which is part of a broader increase in racism that includes Islamophobia, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Asian racism, and anti-Palestinian racism. And we're especially concerned about the rise of far-right extremism. We consider that the only way for us to effectively fight anti-Semitism is by working in partnership with other groups also facing bigotry and discrimination.
By focusing on the health of our society, the health of our democracy, and the health of the marketplace of our ideas. As we speak, there are thousands of people in Australia, young and old, alongside millions of people around the world, heretics all of them, who recognize that there is no path to cohesion that does not involve everybody. They don't buy the stories about each other that my generation peddles. Stories about their classmates, neighbors, workmates, and friends. They're especially conscious about the many ways their interests, political, economic, and social, actually align much more with the people they are told are their enemies than they do with the people doing the telling. If we really care about healing our society, these are voices worth hearing.
It is incredibly powerful to see so many young people waking up, asking questions, young and old people.
Don't you see? Not about the land or the sea, not the country, but the dwelling of His Majesty. Jerusalem, if they forget. The Empire did nothing wrong.
Asda will graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering, Molecular and Cellular Engineering, and a minor in resistance to genocide.
The liberal media is not going to tell you that.
You may not know this, but ASNA is USC's 2024 valedictorian.
Done by about 60, we were burned in the oven in the century.
The strength that I have, the world didn't give it to me.
Get it trying to be free, erase the demons.
The world didn't give it, the world didn't take it away.
Afraid of the past and the darkness.
He was a Sajkur who said, never let anyone tell you who your enemy is. Don't let them tell you that people who are protesting a genocide are your enemy.
Jerusalem, live like forget you. Fire not gonna come from me tongue. Jerusalem, live like forget you. Then my right hand forget what it's supposed to do. Jerusalem, live like forget you. Fire not gonna come from me tongue. Jerusalem, live like forget you. Then my right hand forget what it's supposed to. Said they're caught up in the maze and the world's gone crazy. Them don't know it's just a phase. Case of the Simon says, if I forget the truth, my word won't penetrate. Babylon burning in the place, can't see through the haze. Shut down all of them dirty ways. That's the price that you pay for setting life to the youth. No way, no way, no way, no way. Ain't no one gonna break my stride. Ain't no one that could hold me down. Oh no, I got to keep on moving. Ain't no one that could break my stride. Ain't no one that could hold me down. Oh no, I got to keep on moving. Stay Jerusalem, live like forget you. Fire not gonna come from it on. Jerusalem, live like forget you. Then my right hand forget what it's supposed to do. Jerusalem.